when we're looking at smoking versus vaping. Vaping is probably worse in terms of the damage to the airway and the insulin resistance that comes from it. But this gets worse because we know that insulin resistance is the core for most chronic diseases that are killing us, and there's a handful of other lifestyle habits that's contributing to it.
That's horrifying. So tell me everything.
Dr. Benjamin Bikman is a leading metabolic scientist
whose research focuses on the hidden epidemic of insulin resistance and its devastating consequences.
And by regaining control of your insulin levels, he says you can regain control of your life.
Insulin is a hormone that affects literally every single cell of the body. But if those cells become insulin resistant, you start to spread the disease. For example, they call Alzheimer's insulin resistance of the brain. And even the most common forms of infertility, erectile dysfunction and PCOS, insulin resistance is a heavy contributor. Now, 88% of adults in the US have some degree of insulin resistance. And people hear this and think America is just fat and metabolically sick. But we're not actually the worst country when it comes to this. And part of it is because of how different ethnicities store fat. And I'll come back to that. But there's two roads to insulin resistance. So there's the fast lane, and I could make you insulin resistant in 6 hours with either of these common three things. But if I removed them, your resistance would go away just as quickly. Now, the slow lane, that's a problem. And there's certain lifestyle habits and problems with our diets that are massively contributing to slow insulin resistance. Now, thankfully, this can be resolved through 4 pillars, which are very simple.
We'll get into that, but why don't we just sack all this off and just take a Ozempic?
Well, because people may not know about the negative side effects. For example, 40% of the weight that people are losing on these drugs is coming from... But the bigger the fat cell gets, the more it initiates a cascade of events or a series of events that creates insulin resistance.
And am I right in thinking we have the same amount of fat cells for our whole life pretty much?
That's a really, really safe assumption for most people. Yeah, for most people, a fat cell, sometimes students will hear that fat cells are immortal. That is not true. But they're long-lived. Fat cells will live about 10 years. And so typically, by the time, if you look at a newborn, during infancy, childhood, and puberty, the number of fat cells is going up, 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 up. Once they finish puberty, so mid to late teens for a young woman, late teens or even early 20s for a young man, usually at that point, the number of fat cells they have is going to be very static.
This is something people don't really understand, and I actually discovered it from doing this podcast and speaking to so many experts about this, that we pretty much, especially as an adult, have the same amount of fat cells, really regardless of what we eat.
Yes.
And it's actually just the fat cells we have shrinking
or growing,
or expanding.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Now, there are differences across...
Which, by the way, makes liposuction a pretty fucking bad idea.
In fact, it makes things worse. Please, let's make sure we come back to that.
Okay, I'll write down liposuction.
Because it really becomes, the person ends up, their vanity ends up really ruining their future metabolic outcomes. But there are differences across ethnicity. Like, this is a little oversimplified, but not much. On one end, you'd have Caucasians, kind of Northern European Caucasians. On the other end, you'd have East Asians, like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, East Asians. And then if you look at that same spectrum of people making fat cells through their life, an East Asian will be making fat cells and then stop right about here. So very few fat cells, relatively speaking, across all the ethnicities. They have very few fat cells. A Caucasian on the other end of the spectrum, they went way higher. And so this guy, let's say American Ben versus Chinese Ben, overly simplified, but here we are. So much of fat mass isn't the number of fat cells, even though American Ben has more, it's the size of the fat cell. So I could be the same percent body fat really as Chinese Ben, but that would just be because my fat cells were just that much smaller. But this is the problem then. If you have, let's say, American Ben and Chinese Ben both gained 10 kilos of pure fat over the next 10 years, very easily done. Most people do that quite often. Caucasian Ben just doesn't look as good in his Speedo. Which as a pasty Caucasian, he's not going to look particularly good in that Speedo anyway. But I just am bulging a little more than I was before, but otherwise I'm healthy. My blood pressure is fine, my blood sugar is fine, everything's normal. Put that same 10 kilos of fat on Chinese Ben, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, infertility. And that is because Chinese Ben had fewer fat cells to start with. And so those fat cells, as the body was told to store fat, those fat cells were getting much, much bigger, much sooner. And the fat cell promotes insulin resistance very, very readily. And so that logically moves into the question of, well, what makes fat cells grow? And it is two essential variables that we only ever look at calories. And yet, if you take a person with type 1 diabetes and say, I want you to eat 10,000 calories, but don't give yourself your insulin injection, they cannot gain weight. It is literally impossible for the type 1 diabetic to get fat if they are skipping their insulin injections. In fact, this is so known that if you take, let's imagine a young woman who would maybe have more pressure to be thin than her male counterpart, although it's happening more in males too. Imagine a young girl who gets diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at the age of 13 or 14. Very impressionable time. She's very worried about how she looks and how thin she is. She learns that, wait a minute, I can eat whatever I want, and all I have to do is not inject my insulin, and I'll be as skinny as I want. And it works. It works so well that it's actually a formal eating disorder called diabulimia. So the fact that this exists is absolute proof that the growing and the shrinking of the fat cell is more complicated than just calories being high or low. Because like I'd said earlier, when I talked about hormones are a way for the very tissues of the body to know what it ought to do with energy. And so a fat cell will have energy all around it. And if it doesn't have insulin to tell it what to do, it won't do anything with it. Or maybe to make this more direct, back home in my lab, my students are growing fat cells in petri dishes. These fat cells are swimming in a little sea of calories, lots of glucose, lots of fats, and yet they stay really small until we add insulin. The moment we add insulin into that little petri dish, if we check those cells 4 hours later, they're immediately fatter. If we check them 4 hours later, they're fatter still. Now they know what to do with the energy they have. So with slow insulin resistance, it develops when fat cells get really, really big. It's like because they have to tell insulin, you are telling me to keep growing. I can't keep growing. I'm so big that I'm going to pop. I mean, literally, the fat cell can get so big that it degrades its membrane. It's like a water balloon that a naughty little boy has overfilled and it's about to burst. The fat cell doesn't want to burst. And so it tells insulin, you are trying to make me grow. You're telling me to grow. I can't listen anymore. I'm becoming insulin resistant to stop growing.
So insulin makes you fat?
Oh, very much. Now, a moment ago I said that the big fat cell is two variables. You must have both. You must have both a signal to tell the fat cell to get big, which is insulin. There's no other signal that can do it. You can, in a human, just simply take away the insulin, like type 1 diabetes. It doesn't matter any other hormone in the body. It does not matter. They cannot get fat. They can eat 10,000 calories of chocolate cake. They cannot get fat. Not only can they not get fat, they can't hold on to their fat. Because if there's no insulin to tell the fat cell to hold on to it or get big, it has to shrink. It's breaking down its fat. So the body goes into such a dramatic fat burning state in the absence of insulin that keeping fat becomes impossible. So the insulin signal is necessary to tell the fat cell what to do. But the fat cell will say, okay, insulin, you're high, you're telling me to grow, but what am I going to grow with? That's where the calories come in. Now the fat cell will say, hey, fats and glucose in the blood, insulin has told me to get big, and so I need to pull you in to help me grow. You're going to give me the bulk. And if you have one without the other, it is death.
So if I'm eating 2,000 calories and I have a different insulin sensitivity to you, say we both eat 2,000 calories and I'm insulin resistant, doesn't that mean that
You'll store more as fat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So your body, now it would partly depend on, there are people where if all of your fat cells had reached its maximum point, then you're done. You're not going to gain more fat. You're just going to become more and more and more insulin resistant.
Okay, fine.
So you kind of start limiting yourself. But there are studies in humans to show that if you give humans isocaloric meals, so the exact same number of calories, but they in the same amount of protein, but you differ those meals based on the amount of carbs to the amount of fat. So let's say 2 meals, exact same calories, 2,000 calories, or that's in one meal, that's too high, 1,000 calories in one meal. One version of this is the conventional way of eating, which is lower fat, higher carb. The other meal, same number of calories, but it's lower carb, higher fat. This lower carb, higher fat version will have a lower insulin response, and they will store less fat from that meal. And someone would say, well, where do the calories go? You can't, it's the laws of thermodynamics. You can't destroy energy. The metabolic rate will go up. So when insulin is low, if you have someone going a full day eating the same number of calories but lower carb calories, their metabolic rate will be almost 300 calories higher in that day.
And metabolic rate is the...
Yeah, that's the total amount of energy that it just costs you and I to just live.
Okay, so...
You're just going through the day. But that's a significant amount. Like if you and I were to go exercise and say, let's go burn 300 calories, we got to be on the stair stepper for an hour or something. So it's 300 calories. But at the same time, if your insulin is low, you're burning so much fat that you start making ketones. And I don't intend to get onto that topic quite yet, but suffice it to say, every molecule of a ketone has a caloric load roughly similar to glucose. And what the body, when it starts making a lot of ketones, it starts eliminating the ketones. So every time someone is breathing out ketones, they're literally breathing out calories. Or they're urinating, and they're urinating out ketones if they have higher ketones in their blood. They're urinating out calories because ketones have energy. And so this is the way that if insulin is low, it becomes impossible for the body to hold on to its energy. It is so determined to spend energy that it will both increase metabolic rate and it will make the energy, the calories, be wasted in the breath and in the urine and in the form of ketones, because ketones have calories. Ketones are energy. Now we're just dumping them out into the universe.
It's worth, before we talk about how to keep my insulin levels low so that I can benefit from all the health benefits we've talked about, it's probably also worth just spending a little bit of time trying to understand the evolutionary basis of insulin resistance.
There are some theories that are very interesting that attempt to explain why is it that we became so fantastically different from, let's say, our closest animal relatives, other primates like chimpanzees or apes. What was the difference that had us become so different than them? One of the leading theories is a theory called the expensive tissue hypothesis. And it actually does have something to do with ketones. In the expensive tissue hypothesis, as the theory goes, our earlier ancestors deviated in this kind of animal family line because we started eating more meat. We started eating food that was so nutritious, so nutrient dense, so loaded with good calories and all of the fats and proteins that we need, that it allowed two very distinct changes to occur in us compared to other primates. One, our intestines became significantly shorter. So if you compare the human digestive tract to any other primate animal, if we are a primate, then if you look at the intestines, they're fantastically different, particularly the large intestine or the colon, because our ancestors, as the theory goes, began eating meat. We didn't need the colon as much because the colon is a place for food to ferment. And so if you're eating a lot of plant matter, like other primates do, you need a much, much larger colon. So we started eating food that was so nutrient dense, our colon shrunk considerably. We didn't need to waste energy on a big, busy colon. At the same time, as we were eating food that was so nutrient dense and so loaded with good fat, it allowed us to have more time to be curious and explore. And so at the same time, our intestines were shrinking because we didn't need them to be so big. Our brain was growing. And it's because it had so much nutrition, including ketones. So ketones are an extraordinary fuel for the brain. In fact, one of the reasons why a baby that is born premature will be more likely to have learning disorders later in life is because premature baby didn't have time to get very fat. And fat baby is healthy baby. And fat baby gets into ketosis. Let's say you and I were to fast straight for 2 days. If you took a 6-month-old baby, that baby would be in a deeper state of ketosis in 2 hours than you and I would be in 2 days, because the baby is burning so much of its beautiful chubby fat. And the more the body burns fat, the more it makes ketones. And the tissue of the body that appears to benefit the most in response to ketones is the brain. The brain, the moment ketones hit the blood, stream, the brain immediately starts taking in ketones for a fuel. Very often, I have students who have had a professor, perhaps with the best of intentions, but ignorant nonetheless, tell the student that the main fuel for the brain is glucose, that the brain prefers glucose. And I show them just 1 or 2 papers to prove that wrong immediately. And it is reflected in this idea, which if to use some convenient UK units, if blood glucose is 5 millimolar, that's a concentration, a way of measuring an amount of something. Blood glucose may be 5 millimolar or 80 milligrams per deciliter for the American audience. That would be a normal glucose. And if you and I were to fast for 24 or so hours, we may get up to about 1 millimolar of ketones. And yet, even then, the brain has already switched to get the majority of its energy from the ketone. And so don't tell me that in this dynamic, the brain prefers this one, because this one's 5 times higher than this one. And even in that scenario, the brain is already getting more than half of its energy from the ketone. So all of this is my long-winded way of saying, when we look at the principles of evolution, one of the leading theories is this idea that we began eating essentially a meat-heavy diet that, again, is so nutritious that it allowed our brains to grow. Maybe one final point on this, although it is a bit of a barbed comment, people may find this somewhat amusing or disappointing or frustrating. The title of a book just published, which is that vegetarians have smaller brains. This is seen in humans, that the less a human eats meat, then the smaller the brain becomes. The brain is so dependent on the nutrient density that comes from animal-sourced foods that it will suffer when it doesn't get them.
Interesting. I mean, that's a controversial thing to say.
It is, and you can cut it out. But it really is, it's a real thing. And why does depression go up so much when people stop eating animal-sourced foods? It's because you are depriving the brain of what it needs.
What is it exactly you're depriving the brain of in that situation?
Yeah. So at least, among other things, at least it would be the essential omega-3 fats. So there are 3 omega-3s, and humans can only get 1 from plants, but it's one that the humans don't use. We need the other 2, and they only come from animal source foods.
And you could supplement.
Absolutely.
Right. And that would...
Yeah, you can. But so the solution in that regard is the vegan must be educated enough to know what they're deficient in, and then wealthy enough to afford the supplements to make up for it.
So is that the only evolutionary sort of hypothesis towards why we develop this insulin resistance?
Oh, yeah. In fact, it's funny that you bring the question up again, because I realized I didn't quite answer it that way. So insulin resistance, why would it exist at all? It would probably be a way for the body to know when it was needed to hold on to energy.